Now, this idea that the main function of humor is catharsis, this idea of Freud's, hey, understand that once the methodological revolution came about, a lot of Freud's theory could be tested in a methodological way, and that includes, this theory of humor. And so there's a lot of research actually supporting this theory that humor functions as a catharsis, a release of energy or tension. And this is something that, well, let me give you just one example quickly here. There was a group of researchers who screened for two different groups of participants. Screening meaning they sought them out and found them. So they found a bunch of wives, okay, working wives, who in one group felt that their husband didn't do anywhere near their share of the housework, his share of the housework, and the other group felt that their husband did an equal share of the housework. Okay? And what they did was they showed these women cartoons and then had them rate how funny they were. So these women went through these cartoons and rated how funny they thought they were. And all the cartoons are kind of similar, but let me give you just one example. One of the jokes, I guess they were, was how many men does it take to switch a light bulb? And the answer to the joke as printed was, we'll never know. Okay? And what these researchers found when testing Freud's theory in this way was that the group of women who felt that their husbands did not do their share of housework found the jokes to be significantly more funny. In other words, they had more tension to be released, and so that's how subconsciously we actually judge how funny jokes are, is the amount of tension that is released from us. So going back to that idea that Freud was particularly interested in humor that degraded somebody else, another person or another group, and him finding that to be kind of a window into the soul of the joke teller. He felt that people who tell those kinds of jokes have this real high buildup of thanatos, negative death energy. Okay? And they find a release in telling those kind of jokes and targeting other people in bigoted ways. Now, there is a joke that, if you can, you might have heard this before, but if not, hopefully it will never go over your head again in the future. You will appreciate the roots of this joke, because sometimes people will say, well, let's imagine that, let's take you back to that hypothetical situation where you're telling your therapist about the dream about changing the oil, and the therapist shares his or her interpretation of that dream with you, Freudian therapist, right? Psychoanalyst. And then they come up with this sexual interpretation. Okay? And a variation on this joke would be if you replied and said, yes, but sometimes a dipstick is just a dipstick. Because that is, in fact, how Freud responded when people confronted him about the cigar that he always held in his hand. Even after he quit smoking, he would hold it unlit in his hand. Okay? And when questioned about if that was an oral fixation, because when he was pausing a conversation, even when it wasn't lit, he'd often put it in his mouth, he just grinned and said, well, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. So, let's now move on to our other psychodynamic theorists, okay? Now, they have a lot in common with Freud if you think about the overlying fact that their main focus is on the unconscious. But they do have some differences, and that's why they are oftentimes referred to as neo-Freudians, N-E-O, Freudians, one word. Neo-Freudians. Okay, and the first one we're going to talk about is Carl Jung. I mentioned him before in his dream theory. Who is Carl Jung? Let me tell you just a little bit about him, actually, before we look at this. Carl Jung was actually a student of Freud's. So you might, in today's terms, think of him as a graduate student. So Freud took him under his wing, and he kind of sort of did what you would call today an internship with Freud. And if you look at the relationship that these two men had, it is very academic, very much what we see in graduate schools today with graduate students and their major advisors. And here's the deal. When you're a graduate student, you are there for one purpose. You have found somebody whose work you truly admire, and you want to learn everything they know before you go on and become a therapist. You want to absorb as much as you possibly can from them and learn from them and, you know, have that knowledge and those skills under your belt when you go out into the world as a therapist. And so you are not in graduate school to come up with alternate theories and question theirs, but down the road, you're certainly going to be free to do that, right? And so it is not uncommon for somebody after graduate school to come up with a theory that's different than their advisors was in graduate school. Okay, and that was the case with Carl Jung. And I'll tell you something, Freud did not take to it well. In fact, he took to it really badly. So there was a big rift between these men later on in life. But anyway, Carl Jung, very interesting. He's the first Neo-Freudian we're looking at here. And Jung called his theory analytic psychology. You notice that he's going to focus on this kind of analytic idea. And his major difference with Freud was actually what he felt the driving force of the unconscious was. The most driving force in life, he felt, was spiritual development. Now, Jung had a background. He actually wanted to be a theologian before he became a psychologist, and then he got sidetracked because he really got intrigued with Freud's work. But he still remained a very spiritual person, and he felt that no matter how spiritually developed you are, that through your life there's a constant tug to become more, even if you're not at all, or even if you are very much so compared to your peers, that this will last throughout life and there'll always be a tug. And he felt the most driving force in life is developing in that manner spiritually. He totally loved Freud's theory of levels of awareness. And he actually furthered that in a very interesting way. So remember that Freud had 3 different levels, and the third one was the unconscious, right? Stuff we know that we don't know we know. And Freud went further in theory here and broke this down. So he theorized that there were 2 components to the unconscious level of awareness. So 2 components to the unconscious being the personal unconscious, which would simply be what Freud was talking about, all that information that you learned in your lifetime at some point, but you don't remember learning. You don't know you know. Okay? But you also proposed the idea of a collective unconscious. And I'll tell you what is most fascinating about this idea. Okay, after I tell you the idea itself. So the idea itself was he felt that maybe memories were passed on from our ancestors. Now, obviously, if a memory is passed on and you didn't firsthand, learn it firsthand, it's going to be more like a memory trace, right? In other words, it's going to be more vague than the memories of things you have that are more concrete and filled in, okay, and elaborate. But this whole idea is just so intriguing. I mean, some of Jung's colleagues really thought he was out there, that he was off his rocker, when he talked about this idea of maybe it's, memories could be passed on in the genes through our ancestors. Because the idea here is, what? Something non-physical? I mean, we know that physical traits and such are passed on through the genes, but what about psychological ones? Wow, that's an interesting thought. In fact, think about that situation, where you walked into a room and felt like, God, I know I've never been here in my lifetime, but this feels, familiar. Not everybody has experienced it, but actually a number of people have reported that experience. And, you know, this would help to explain that if it were true. Well, I can't say that we have evidence outside of what Jung collected for his particular idea of memories, but I can tell you that now we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that part of your personality, which is psychological, is passed on in your genes from your parents. And as you know, we're going to be learning about that in our biological week and why it is that we know that. Know it. We don't theorize about it. We know it. Hey, how can we know that? We'll learn about that then. But, Jung was one of the first people to propose this idea, that maybe something that was not physical could be passed on genes, that was psychological. And he was talking here about ideas, kind of major ideas. And he actually he traveled around the world. He went and looked within many cultures, visiting some cultures that had never been visited by people outside of their island before, for instance. And what he found was that there were some ideas that humans just seem to have. In other words, they're too similar. How could they all, if there's no communication going on between them, how could they come up with the same kind of idea? Okay? And that he finds in every single culture that he looked at. And one example of that would be some kind of a supreme being or beings. Okay? And another example was like the concept of Earth Mother. Okay? And so if you want to read more about that, you are going to want to look, in your university library, and you might want to go to Cycle It, for example, and then punch in archetypes, and you can read more about that. Because that's what he called those ideas that he found in every culture, archetypes, okay, that he thought, theorized that these ideas were passed on through the generations in a genetic way. Okay? But then now, Jung is also quite famous for this idea of extroversion, introversion, this dimension that goes all the way from extroversion to introversion. But sometimes this is misunderstood. So he did work a lot with that dimension and write a lot about it, that trait dimension. But oftentimes people think that introversion means somebody is shy. Jung was not shy, but I'll tell you something, he preferred to read a book or to be writing than to be with other people most of the time. Okay? And that's what is meant by introversion, is preferring your own company, your own thoughts, okay, to being in the company of other people. And extroversion being the opposite, preferring the company of other people, being around them, to being by yourself, maybe reading or writing or digesting your own thoughts. Okay? And believe it or not, it's not related to being shy. So if people are shy, it's usually because of something like social anxiety and not just preferring to be alone. And like I said, Jung, by the way, was very much an introvert himself. But he was great at public speaking. Just given the choice, what he would prefer to be doing. And, there's a very famous scale out that many of you might have heard of before called the Myers-Briggs inventory. And sometimes people think that Jung wrote that, and he didn't. Meyer and Briggs did. Okay, they developed that scale. But I do want you to know one thing. It's very interesting. You could Google it. You can go online and you can take it. Okay, and it can serve a function because it's very interesting. It can get you to think about what kind of future careers you might be well geared for. But as a personality measure, the reliability and validity statistics are not very impressive at all. So that's why you're not going to see that come into play in this class. Okay. Now, so speaking of Jung and extroversion, now you can pull out your self-assessment sheet and go to your score for questionnaire number 2. And it is time to interpret that. So you first off can go ahead now and write in the name line extroversion. And let me tell you first what the possible range was in the scale. The lowest possible points you could have gotten on the scale is 20, and the highest is 140. And the mean for you, the context mean for you to interpret your score with. The mean for ASU students who have taken personality psychology in the past is 88. 88. This is really interesting because some people are more around the middle of the scale. So it's pretty clear, you know, that if your score is probably around 63 or below, that you are an introvert. And if it's like 113 or higher, that you are an extrovert. But there's something in the middle, right? A lot of people, most people in fact, their score is somewhere between 64 and 112. And what's interesting about that, there's a term for it, it's ambivert, right? Meaning you can go both ways, ambivert, okay? And here's something really interesting that just came out more recently in research. You know that oftentimes employers that are looking for salespeople in the past have looked for people who are extroverted, and they probably will for a while because it takes a while for new research, and this is brand new, this just came out. So it takes a while for new research to reach employers in a way that, and for them to actually use it takes even longer. But new research has shown that actually people who are ambiverts tend to be better at sales than extroverts. There's a lot of different theories why that is. We don't know for sure. But I think that the most believable theory, the most plausible one, is that extroverts might be a little too much in your face and might actually drive some people away from loitering longer and making a decision to buy something.